A woman is dragged naked over cobblestones while the street itself seems to bite into her skin. Stone ridges, grit, the cold shock of public air. But the part that makes your stomach turn isn't the dragging. It's the children. Her children, small hands, lifting stones, because adults are watching. Because the crowd has decided that love is conditional and survival requires participation. She hasn't been convicted of anything. There is no courtroom, no sworn testimony, no evidence laid out on a table, just a rumor passed mouth to mouth until it hardens into truth. And then, like a switch being flipped, neighbors become executioners with clean consciences. That's the mechanism, not rage, permission. And it doesn't stop at humiliation. It escalates into rituals so controlled, so formalized, so rehearsed that even the priests tasked with sanctifying it reportedly vomit. Imagine that for a second. Men trained to watch suffering. Men whose job is to stand close to blood and grief, losing control of their bodies because what they're overseeing crosses a line even their theology can't soften. This isn't a story designed to shock you. It's a record of what was done over and over, in different towns, under different crowns, with the same logic, because that's what this is. Logic. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the documents that made this possible, the legal language, the civic ordinances, the testimonies that read like horror scripts but were filed as paperwork. You'll see punishments engineered not just to hurt one woman, but to teach thousands of women what their bodies belong to. You'll see how spectacle becomes policy, how a crowd becomes an instrument, how cruelty becomes routine. And here's the detail that should disturb you most. The architects of this system weren't hiding in back alleys, grinning like villains. They were the respectable ones. Priests, magistrates, community elders, men who believed they were protecting order, protecting families, protecting God's design. They weren't asking, how can we be evil? They were asking, how can we be effective? And that question, when applied to human bodies, creates machines. Before we get into the specific punishments, you need to understand the foundation. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't random violence. It was a system that could travel across centuries, across borders. From Norway's frost-covered villages to Spain's sun-baked squares, because it was built on an idea. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was not fully hers. The moment she married, law often treated her as covered, absorbed into her husband's legal identity, his property, and like property, harm to her was framed not as a crime against her, only as a violation against the man who owned the loss. What matters now is understanding why that violence was not just permitted, but required. In medieval Europe, an adulteress was not simply a woman who had broken a private vow. She was understood as someone who had committed a public crime, a crime against property, against inheritance, against the fragile architecture that held power together. When a woman stepped outside marriage, she was not seen as betraying a husband's trust. She was seen as stealing his future. This is not metaphor. It was legal logic. In a world without DNA tests, without birth certificates, without reliable records of paternity, bloodline was everything. Land passed through sons. Titles passed through sons. Alliances between families, cities, even kingdoms depended on the assumption that a man's heirs were biologically his. That certainty was the most valuable asset a man possessed. And the only mechanism society had to protect it was control total. Absolute sexual control over women. So when a woman was accused of adultery, the threat was not emotional, it was economic. Her infidelity did not merely wound pride, it threatened to redirect property, titles, and wealth into another man's lineage. It could fracture families, dissolve contracts, invalidate treaties sealed through marriage. From the perspective of the system, this was not a moral lapse. It was sabotage, and systems respond to sabotage with force, but not random force, not chaotic rage. What followed was calculated, proportional, designed. The punishment had to be severe enough to prevent not just one woman from transgressing, but thousands from even considering it. Pain alone was insufficient. Death was inefficient. What the system needed was memory, something so vivid, so public, so humiliating that every woman who witnessed it would carry the image with her for the rest of her life. That is why these punishments were theatrical. They were staged in public spaces. They involved neighbors, children, priests, officials. The cruelty was not a side effect. It was the message. Each ritual was a warning written onto a living body. And here is the most disturbing part. The communities that carried them out were not filled with monsters. They were filled with ordinary people, people who believed they were protecting order, protecting families, protecting God's law. They were conditioned to see this violence not as excess, but as duty, as righteousness, as necessity, which brings us to the punishment considered merciful. They called it the carting, or the penance walk, gentle names, almost pastoral. But those words hide something far more deliberate. This was psychological warfare, disguised as justice. And the first weapon in that war was the shaving. Imagine you are a woman in a 14th century German town. What followed was not sudden violence. It was ritual. If the previous logic explained why the punishment had to be severe, this is where the system shows how it made that severity visible. Before dawn, the bailiff arrives at your door with his men. They do not knock politely. They break the door open. Not because resistance is expected, but because the spectacle begins at home. Arrest is not meant to be private. It is meant to be witnessed. Your children are not sent away. They are held back and forced to watch as you are dragged into the street. Fear works better when it is inherited. You are taken to the town square, where a rough wooden stool has already been prepared. Nothing here is improvised. The placement is central, the timing deliberate. A barber steps forward. Often, he is a familiar figure, the same man who has shaved your husband for years, who has worked inside your home, who knows your family. That familiarity is not accidental. It turns the act into betrayal. Not just punishment. He does not shave carefully. Historical records from Augsburg describe how the shaving was intentionally done to disfigure, rather than simply remove hair. Patches were left uneven. The scalp was cut. Blood was allowed to show. The goal was not cleanliness, but degradation. One account from 1487 records a woman begging the barber to at least make it even. The crowd laughed. Her humiliation was part of the event, but the shaving was not mere cruelty. It was symbolic erasure. In medieval Europe, a woman's hair was not a neutral feature. It carried meaning. Hair signified femininity, honor, sexual status, and social order. Joan of Arc would later be accused of heresy, in part for cutting her hair short. For married women, covered or bound hair marked modesty and lawful submission. To shave it publicly was to strip away that identity, to announce that she no longer occupied the category of woman as society recognized it. This is why the punishment escalated. After the shaving came the stripping. In some regions, the law allowed a thin shift to remain. In others, particularly in England and parts of France, complete nudity was explicitly required. This was not about exposure alone. Public female nudity was believed to be spiritually contaminating. A naked woman in public space was considered a walking curse, a moral pollutant. The system understood this. By removing clothing after removing hair, the punishment erased not only personal dignity, but social belonging. What stood in the square was no longer a wife, a mother, or a neighbor. It was a warning, and the town was about to be forced to read it. What comes after the shaving is not uniform. And that variation is not accidental. In some regions, the woman is left in a thin shift, little more than a nightgown. The fabric clings to her body, translucent in daylight, offering just enough cover to remind everyone that mercy is being performed. In other regions, particularly in England and parts of France, the law is explicit. No shift, no covering. Complete nudity is required. This distinction matters because the purpose is not exposure. It is contamination. In medieval theology, Public female nudity is not merely shameful, it is spiritually dangerous. A naked woman outside the private sphere is believed to disrupt the moral order itself. She is not just dishonored. She is polluting. Her body becomes a kind of walking curse, something that corrupts the air she moves through. This is why the law insists on nudity in certain jurisdictions. The punishment is not only for her, it is for everyone forced to witness her. And this is where the real psychological torture begins. She is not marched through random streets. The route is chosen carefully. First past her own home, the place she will never return to as a wife. Then past the church where she was married, where vows once spoken are now publicly undone. Then past the market where she bought bread, past the well where she drew water, past the homes of people who have known her since childhood. Each location is a memory turned into a weapon. At every stop, the crowd grows. But here is the detail that transforms cruelty into system. Participation is not optional. Town records from across medieval Europe make this clear. Citizens who refused to attend these processions could be fined. Absence itself was treated as defiance. Neighbors, friends, even relatives were legally compelled to be present. Silence was not neutrality. It was resistance. And resistance was punished. This ensured something crucial. The woman was not just humiliated. She was collectively erased. Everyone who had once known her was forced to witness her destruction. Every relationship was conscripted into the punishment. The baker who sold her bread, the priest who baptized her children, the neighbor who shared meals with her, all of them were turned into instruments of enforcement. Whether they wished to be or not, by the time the procession ends, the woman has not simply been punished by the law. She has been abandoned by the community, in full view, by design. The system does not rely on private violence. It relies on shared memory, and once that memory is implanted, it does not fade. What happens next is where the system reveals its true efficiency. Because watching was never enough. The crowd was not assembled merely to observe suffering. They were expected to participate in it. Court documents from across medieval Europe make this explicit. People did not just stand along the route. They threw things. Rotten vegetables at first, then stones. Mud mixed with human waste. Dead animals hauled from refuse pits and flung at a body already stripped of dignity. This was not spontaneous cruelty. It was ritualized permission. A record from Toulouse in 1342 describes a woman struck in the face by a sharp bone. She lost an eye on the street, where she had grown up. Another account mentions a pregnant woman who miscarried during the procession, her body collapsing under a combination of blows, exhaustion, and terror. The crowd did not stop. The officials did not intervene. No one was punished. Because nothing had gone wrong, this was working exactly as intended. The procession was designed to last. In small towns, it might take an hour. In large cities, it could stretch to 6 or 7. Authorities deliberately chose the longest possible route, dragging the woman through marketplaces, religious districts, residential streets, under a blazing summer sun or in freezing rain. She was forced to keep moving. If she stumbled, she was pulled upright. If she collapsed, she was dragged. Some women fainted. Others screamed until their voices broke, until words dissolved into incoherent sounds that only fueled the crowd's excitement. Madness was not a side effect. It was part of the spectacle. And then came the final cruelty. Quieter, but no less calculated. The return home. The procession did not end at a courthouse or prison. It ended at her own doorstep. There, the crowd dispersed, their work complete. What waited for her was absence. Doors locked, windows shuttered. Husbands had already been instructed not to receive her. Children had been told not to speak to her. In some cases, neighbors had already claimed her belongings, piling furniture and clothing into the street, as if dividing the remains of someone already dead. This moment mattered more than the stones, because this was not about pain alone. It was about removal. The woman was not executed. She was erased. She was returned to the place where her life had once made sense, only to discover that it no longer existed. The system did not need to chase her away. It simply ensured there was nowhere left to stand. What followed was not recovery. It was something far colder. Social death had been completed, but the punishment didn't end when the procession stopped. That is what made it so psychologically devastating. What followed was not a moment of shame, but a lifetime sentence. A woman who had been dragged through the streets did not simply return to her life, marked and humiliated. She returned as someone fundamentally altered in the eyes of her community. She could not remarry. No respectable household would take her in. No guild would employ her. Even in church, the one place that claimed mercy, she was forced to sit in a separate section reserved for public penitence, a living reminder of her supposed sin. Worship became another form of exposure. The records are mercilessly consistent. A Parisian chronicle notes a woman who, 15 years after her penance walk, was still recognized on the street and spat on by strangers who had never known her before the accusation. The ritual did not fade with time. It was designed not to. This was social death by design, a controlled erasure that left the body alive while stripping away identity, dignity, and future. And here is the part that feels almost unbelievable to modern readers. This was considered the merciful option: public humiliation, lifelong exclusion, economic ruin. This was what the system offered when proof was insufficient, when evidence was weak, when witnesses contradicted one another, when certainty could not be achieved. In those cases, the law did not hesitate. It escalated, because when accusation alone could not satisfy justice, medieval Europe turned to something it believed was even purer: trial by ordeal. Even the phrase sounds primitive to us now, heavy with superstition and cruelty. But to the people who lived inside this system, it was not barbarism. It was the ultimate safeguard, a mechanism that removed human judgment entirely and placed the decision in God's hands. They believed, truly believed, that divine intervention would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. That belief is what makes what followed so horrifying. The most common ordeal imposed on accused adulteresses was trial by cold water. It was not random. It was not improvised. It was rooted in theology, ritual, and law. Water, blessed by a priest, was considered pure, holy, incapable of accepting corruption. If a woman was innocent, the water would receive her. If she was guilty, it would reject her. And so her body became evidence, not testimony, not witnesses, not truth. Her body, floating or sinking, would decide whether she lived or died. What came next was not chaos. It was procedure. If the penance walk was designed to kill a woman socially, the next step was meant to let God decide whether she deserved to die at all. That was the logic, at least. The theology behind trial by cold water reveals a kind of twisted genius, one that feels chilling precisely because it was internally coherent. The water used in these ordeals was never ordinary. It was blessed by a priest, often drawn directly from a baptismal font or consecrated through an elaborate ritual. This mattered. In medieval Christian thought, water was not neutral. It was a moral substance. The reasoning worked like this: baptismal water washed away sin and welcomed the faithful into God's grace. If water could accept the pure, it would reject the impure. A sinner's body, still marked by corruption, would be refused by holy water. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. To medieval jurists and theologians, this was not superstition. It was logic. And logic justified procedure. Based on surviving court records from England, France, and the German states, the process followed a remarkably standardized pattern. At dawn, always dawn, the accused woman would be brought to a river, a pond, or a specially constructed pool. Dawn symbolized judgment, renewal, divine clarity. It also ensured maximum visibility. The entire village was required to attend. Again, witnessing was compulsory. Justice, in this system was never private. A priest would lead the ceremony. He would bless the water, recite prayers, and formally invite God to reveal his judgment. The woman was not treated as innocent until proven guilty. She was treated as a question awaiting an answer. Her body was the medium through which that answer would be delivered. She would be stripped down to her shift, not naked, but vulnerable. Then came the binding. This detail appears explicitly in legal texts, such as the Saxon Spiegel and regional law codes. Her right thumb was tied to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe. The bindings curled the body inward, compressing the limbs into a position that made swimming impossible. Some regions added a rope around the waist. This rope was not a safety measure. It was for retrieval. The woman was then thrown into the water or ordered to jump while the crowd watched in silence. What followed was not a test of innocence, but a demonstration of inevitability. If she floated, the water had rejected her. She was guilty. If she sank, the water had accepted her. Either result could kill her, and in that moment, theology, law, spectacle, and violence fused into a single act that everyone present believed was justice being done. The binding is the moment when ritual becomes certainty. Her right thumb tied to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe, the body folded inward, curled into a shape that cannot swim, cannot reach, cannot resist. It looks ceremonial, almost symmetrical, as if balance itself were being enforced. In some regions, they add a rope around her waist. This detail matters because it reveals the truth hiding beneath the theology. The rope is not a safeguard. It is not there to save her. It is there so the body can be recovered afterward. The outcome has already been anticipated. The procedure accounts for death as a normal variable. She is brought to the edge of the water while the village watches, not spectators by choice, but by obligation. This is justice performed publicly, because fear must be shared to be effective. Sometimes she is thrown. Sometimes she is ordered to jump herself. That distinction is meaningless. Once she enters the water, the test begins. And this is where belief collides with physics. A human body floats or sinks for reasons that have nothing to do with innocence. Lung capacity, body fat, the temperature of the water, panic. A terrified woman, breathing rapidly, filling her lungs with air, may float at first. And floating is guilt. Rejection by holy water. Proof, they believe, that God has turned away. She is dragged back to shore and executed, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a brief prayer meant to cleanse the crowd of doubt. But if she sinks, if her bound body drops beneath the surface, that is innocence, acceptance, vindication. And yet a bound woman sinking in water cannot swim. She cannot breathe. Innocence does not lift her back to the surface. It only changes how long they wait. The records are inconsistent. Some officials pulled women out after moments. Others waited through an entire prayer. Minutes pass differently when you are watching a body disappear beneath water. When she is finally dragged out, if she is dragged out, she may be declared innocent. She may also be unconscious, brain damaged, or already dead. The system considers this acceptable. God has spoken. The outcome is justified. This is the cruel genius of the ordeal. Either result confirms the system's righteousness. Float and die, and justice has been served. Sink and die, and innocence has been proven. Survival is incidental, rare, almost beside the point. What matters is not truth. What matters is spectacle that feels divinely sanctioned, a punishment that allows everyone involved, priests, officials, neighbors, to believe they are not choosing violence. They are merely witnessing God's judgment, carried out by water, rope, and silence. You don't die the moment you go under. That is the detail the records make impossible to ignore. What happens instead is waiting. Medieval legal sources show astonishing variation in how long officials allowed a woman to remain submerged before intervention. There was no fixed rule. Some accounts describe mere moments long enough to see whether the body floated. Others describe delays measured not in seconds, but in ritual. A full prayer had to be spoken, sometimes more than one. In certain regions, that meant 5 minutes or longer, an eternity for bound lungs already starved of air. This inconsistency was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The absence of limits ensured that judgment always retained plausible deniability. A chronicle from England, dated 1194, records the case of a woman named Edith. She was accused not by a stranger, but by her husband's brother, a charge rooted in proximity rather than proof. As was customary, she was subjected to trial by cold water. The account is brief, almost disturbingly so. She sank like a stone, the chronicler writes. She was pulled from the water, nearly drowned. The verdict followed immediately. Innocent. The water had accepted her. God's judgment was declared complete. The body, however, was not finished paying the price. Edith suffered severe brain damage from oxygen deprivation. She died 3 days later. The record closes with administrative precision. Her husband was ordered to provide her with Christian burial because she had been proven innocent by divine judgment. The system recorded no contradiction. Justice had been served. Death was merely collateral. This is the psychological core of the ordeal. You are accused of a crime you may never have committed. Your fate depends on physics, disguised as theology on buoyancy, breath control, water temperature, panic. Either outcome can kill you, and throughout, you are instructed to believe that God is watching, judging, and will save you if you deserve saving. Imagine the terror embedded in that belief. If you sink and drown, did God abandon you? If you float and are executed, did he condemn you? The ordeal traps the accused inside a theological paradox, where innocence offers no guarantee of survival and guilt is often irrelevant. Meaning itself becomes unstable. The cruelty here is not chaotic. It is exquisitely structured. Responsibility is diffused upward to God, to ritual, to doctrine, while human agents remain clean. No one pushes long enough to kill you. No one holds you down. They simply wait. And waiting, sanctified by prayer, becomes lethal. This is why trial by water was not simply a punishment. It was an instrument designed to erase moral accountability. Death could always be explained. Innocence could still be claimed, and the system could continue, intact, unchallenged, convinced of its own righteousness even as bodies were pulled from the water, alive or dead, both equally useful to the machinery of justice. If you found this story thought-provoking, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. History is not only about what happened, but why it mattered. Follow for more stories that explore power, fear, and the human mind.